Thank you for joining us here tonight in the opening of the Indigenous Design Past, Present, Future Symposium. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to their elders and families past and present. We acknowledge that the land on which we meet is a place of age-old ceremonies, of celebrations, initiation and renewal, and that the local Indigenous peoples continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. Tonight marks the opening of a truly special event. It's the faculty's inaugural annual symposium, which this year will explore the role of Indigenous design and showcase local and international First Nations design practitioners. It is indeed a great privilege to have these leading practitioners from a range of disciplines, from around the globe and across Australia, speaking at the symposium over the next few days. I'd like to thank the speakers who are here tonight for taking part in this event. I'm sure those of you in the audience who are attending the presentations over the next few days are looking forward to hearing their insights. This symposium is a very important thing in that it is an Indigenous-led symposium. I hope it is a step on a journey that is the ever-strengthening Indigenous presence in design. This year's event has been curated by Jeff Greenaway, evolving from his important work across Victoria, especially as founder of the Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria, but also here as the faculty, where he's working on Indigenous curriculum development. Through this curriculum development, we seek to normalise the connection to Indigenous culture in our built environment teachings. This has clear significance for the disciplines we teach here at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, given the deep connection to place. Through this curriculum work, we hope to further enrich students' connection with Australia's Indigenous heritage, no matter where they come from. This symposium is presented in collaboration with the Koori Heritage Trust, Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria and Murrup Burrup. It has been endorsed by the International Council of Design. I'd like to now introduce tonight's signature keynote speaker, Mphethi Morojele, who has travelled from South Africa to present here. Mphethi is the owner and founder of MMA Design Studio, an award-winning practice in Johannesburg. He studied architecture at the University of Cape Town and at the Bartlett in London before becoming a studio lecturer in the School of Architecture at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. His built and critical work has been recognised locally and abroad for engaging the African landscape through a contemporary interpretation of Indigenous knowledge and cultural practices. He has curated exhibitions on South African architecture and urbanity at, amongst others, the Venice Biennale, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and ADAS in Berlin. Please join me in a warm welcome for our guest, Mphethi Morojele.
Wow, good evening. They say that dance is actually the origins of architecture, and I think tonight what we saw is that indeed dance, in the way that it's a spatial practice, is the origins of architecture. So I'll start by greeting you all in isiZulu, which is the language of AmaZulu, where we come from. We say sanbonani, and sawubona means I see you, and I see you in me as much as I see me in yourself. And this is at the core of our beliefs in how we as human beings relate to each other, in that I can only be myself because you are you, and you can only be yourself because of me. And in that way, we have a commonality in terms of our humanity. So I'm honored to be invited to participate in this symposium. Already in some of the initial discussions we've had with colleagues, it's been very interesting how a lot of things that we talk about are quite common, no matter where we come from. What you see here on the slides is a project which is called The Dream, or Chapo. And it says that a dream is not a dream until it has been dreamt by the whole community. And I'll explain later on how that came about. So my name is Mphethi. The P and the T you see in my first name have an H behind them because it's a soft P as opposed to a hard P that we have in our language. So it's Mphethi, the name, and what it means is that it's somebody who accomplishes what they've set out to do. So I hope I live up to my name this evening. You will excuse me, of course, I took a journey that originally took thousands of years from the cradle of humankind in Africa, across continents, across seas to arrive here. Okay, it took me 16 hours, but philosophically that's a 10,000-year journey. So when I was asked to present at this symposium, I looked at the idea of what is it meant by indigenous design. And why are we being asked to go back to where we come from, especially with us who are where we come from, we think. And of course, with all the issues around migration that we see happening in the world today about who can arrive by what means, who belongs and who owns. And when you look at I went back to look at the meanings of indigenous to see if there's a clue in that. So the dictionary says various things originating or occurring naturally in a particular place. In other words, being native to a place. Occurring naturally. Belonging in the country in which they are found. So already that suggests that there's an external gaze looking in and finding. Naturally existing in a place or country rather than arriving from another place. And basically it looks at the world's population. And in one way or another, we're all indigenous. We all come from somewhere. We might not be, in fact, we even politically now can be naturalized into places. So in a sense, and coming from Africa where everything began, there's an idea that we are all African and we are all indigenous. If you look at ideas around origins, where do you originate? What does it mean to, the origins? It's talking to a belonging. I think we all long for belonging somewhere, or saying that this is where we originate. It's a kind of a human need to belong. Ownership. Similarly, we all have a need to feel that we own a piece of this planet, and that we have a right to it. Identity, again, it's when you're locating that sense of origin located to a place, it begins to say that you have a specific identity or ethnicity. And this all then talks to boundaries, where my origins start and where do yours end, and whether those boundaries are fixed as we have now politically, or whether, as First Nations believe, these boundaries are shifting all the time. So in a sense, we're talking about how we've come in the modern world to define race and ethnicity, where race is a socially defined category, socially defined, not biologically, but on perceived differences. Similarly, ethnicity, the idea that ethnicity is also socially defined based on common languages, religions, natural history, and other cultural factors. However, in our belief, we should be giving equal citizenship to all the animals and not just human beings. And in that sense, how do we then redefine ourselves as biological beings that inhabit the same planet as all the animals, the plants, etc.? It means that we all inhabit a finite resource, which is our planet. And this is kind of a current idea around post-globalization, where people are talking about moving into planetization. Globalization, which was about trade, global trade and competition, and growth. Everybody's about growth. Whereas planetization, we're moving towards understanding that we have a finite resource, which is our planet, and that it's more about sharing than competition. And once again, the kind of African idea of time is that it's cyclical, it's not a linear process. And that we're, like the future is a distant memory, and that we're actually heading to where we come from already. So a lot of the philosophies of the first peoples are relating to some of the challenges that we are faced today. So the whole concept of planetization and sustainability is actually a philosophy that comes from many, many years ago. So if you talk about go back to where you come from, this is a map that's, again, contested territory, but it's a map that talks to where human beings originated from and possibly how the earth was then peopled. Starting kind of in the Rift Valley of Africa, where the oldest fossils of human beginnings were found, and how people traveled 60,000 years, 50,000 years, 40,000 years across the planet. Of course, this is a postulated idea. We don't know 100% how this may have happened. So again, it was interesting when we saw the previous performance that they talked about observation of animals. Just to talk a little bit about where I come from. I come from a clan of elephants. In our culture, each clan has a totem, and my totem is the elephants, and therefore we kind of observe the behavior of your totem, and you try and emulate that totem. So with us, we are always taught that the herd is more important than the individual, and the characteristics of elephants looking after both young and old, and even burying their young and old, become central to how we see ourselves as elephants. I come from a place called Lesotho, which you can see the geographical map of, is a country which is completely surrounded by South Africa through a kind of a historical accident. Although having originated kind of in the area of KwaZulu-Natal and having crossed over through some of the tribal wars or wars of separation into the fort of Lesotho because of the mountains, which is a place of incredible beauty and a place of incredible history that spans way back. As I say, for me, it's a country of incredible beauty, mountainous, with very specific flora and fauna that's found almost uniquely in that kind of Drakensberg range. And that has then spawned quite a unique culture of Africans who live in very high altitude, it snows there, and who have a very particular sensibility because of the mountains and because of quite a harsh environment. And that has kind of inspired and influenced a lot of my work, as you'll see going forward. The country with its a lot of soft sandstone rock has a lot of cave formations, and these caves allowed the earliest inhabitants to find shelter in these spaces. You can see this image of some of the earliest dwellings that were built after the period of the cave dwellings. And so when I was looking back for this conference, I was starting to look at what it means to go back to where you come from. And if you go back even further, you find that the original inhabitants, of which there's still evidence, are the dinosaurs. You can see on the right the fossils of dinosaur footprints. So some of these rocks are some of the oldest formations in the world that you had dinosaurs. And then following on that was the inhabitation by the First Nations, or what we call the Khoisan in South Africa, who evidence again goes way back in terms of how they used to inhabit and mark the spaces that they inhabited with the rock art. So in other words, our origins go even further back than being from a Sotho Zulu culture into being part of a Khoisan culture. Maybe it explains my stature a little bit. So it made me interested in this idea of dwelling. How do we understand dwelling in the sense of the original inhabitants of South Africa? Dr. Sichaba Mape has done a lot of research at the University of Wits on the indigenous inhabitants, the original indigenous inhabitants, the Khoisan, and how their worldview influenced their understanding of environment. So his thesis was entitled Order, Chaos, Stability, and Flux. And it looked at the role of ritual as self-induced trauma in the South African hunter-gatherer in terms of environmental adaptation. So this I found very interesting in that it kind of resonated with a lot of work that is currently being done around neurosciences in architecture, but I'll explain that a bit further. What he looked at was several factors of how the Khoisan inhabited their natural environment. So he looked at place attachment as one aspect. He looked at movement as adaptation to environmental variability. He looked at the importance of ritual as a tool of reconstructing boundaries of yourself. And then again, the role of rituals in Khoisan environmental adaptation. And finally, he looked at the potential of ritual as a response to contemporary crisis. And some of the work we've been doing, you'll see, really tries to find spaces for ritual, as we've seen in the performance here, that we actually bring these out in our cities. So in terms of place attachment, Mape's study revealed that contrary to popular notions, the First Nations of Southern Africa were nomadic not by choice, but by circumstances. A study of the climatic data revealed an ever-changing landscape where in order to survive, people had to constantly be on the move in search of resources. So even with nomadic peoples, there's always that attachment to place. And in this case, the attachment to place was marked through markings that showed that this was a special place in the lives of the Khoisan. However, they had to keep on moving as they adapted to changing seasons, climatic change, the movement of animals, availability of water, etc. So although one is naturally has a need to be rooted, the circumstances required that they keep on moving into different areas. And therefore they had to adopt ways of adapting to the fact that they would have to be on the move all the time. So the way that they used to kind of adopt was through the use of rituals. Because through rituals they could reconstruct what they call boundaries of self. Being is dwelling. A changing environment requires a changing self, and therefore a heightened awareness of the relationship between inner and outer worlds. So because they had to keep adapting to new circumstances all the time, each time they adapted, they had to carry out rituals which would kind of change how they perceived themselves into a new self. And therefore the importance of rituals became, and the spaces in which rituals were carried out, kind of became the markers of their boundary and of their territories. So it wasn't like fixed boundaries which, you said this is where we belong, but a network of sacred spaces that made up country, if you like. So the dances which were designed to get you into a trance state were really designed to kind of create trauma that would get you out of yourself and into a kind of a liminal state where you are halfway between one condition and another condition. And so it's kind of breaking down your personality, to rebuild you, to be adapted to a new environment. So that shift was done through trances. And then the ways that they used psychotropic substances, sensory deprivation, fasting, meditation, these are all psychological ways in which you broke down yourself and moved into states of sometimes euphoria, which meant that you were kind of now psychologically part of your environment, and you are subsumed into the environment as a way of changing yourself. So the rhythmic movements, the sound of rattles, the women's clapping, and the intensity of their concentration combined to alter the state of consciousness. And that began to move you along what they say is an intensified trajectory, and eventually you fall into unconsciousness to be born into a new consciousness. So that whole idea of dissolving boundaries between yourself and the extent of your body and your environment, so that you are seen as one with the environment. And that kind of embodied experience was something that was used in order to cope with having to move through different environments, sometimes very alien environments. So you can see from an analysis of some of the paintings that were done, these paintings were done also to induce a state of trance, where it was all about dissolving boundaries, even between your humanity and those of the animals, yourself and those of the environment. So in this way, there's that idea that we are all part of the environment gets reinforced each time, and that you are your environment. So in a sense, that research, which talked about evidence and identification of that place attachment and movement as an adaptation to environmental versatility, the result of all of that was that contemporary, in terms of a contemporary situation, we need to shift our worlds to imagine a non-Cartesian model of reality. So you move from the ego with the human being at the top to a kind of eco, which is where we are seen as giving equal citizenship to all the other living beings on the planet, and a reestablishment of the practices of embodiment. So moving away from a kind of a rational idea of working only with the mind, but where the body, and one can see through the body and not only through the mind and the eyes. World shifting implies non-Cartesian model of reality, over emphasis on objectivist paradigms. So now we're moving away from objective paradigms into a much more embodied view of the world. So that reestablishment of embodiment and embodied practice, this has become important in some of our work in South Africa. And questioning the idea of the physical and psychological sedentary nature of human beings. We're all on the move. We all inhabit this globe all the time. So the question is, for architecture, what are the implications? To quote Juhani Pallasmaa, one of my favorite architects, he says, the world of art and architecture is fundamentally an animistic world, awakened to life by our own intuitions and feelings. This comes from his book, Mind in Architecture. So once again, what I'm saying is that a lot of the work that currently is being done in architecture around neuroscience is knowledge that is embodied in First Nations peoples and has always been there for a long time. So in a way, we're going full circle back to where we come from. So some of the examples of embodiment in architecture and the use of ritual, this is a project we did in South Africa where for the first time you'll see our previous president actually using traditional indigenous knowledge at a national event on a national platform. Now obviously coming from a country where these voices were suppressed, became quite a big thing that the new nation could use indigenous knowledge systems at the level at a national state level. These are just some of the principles around that, which I won't go through much for architects. the idea of containment, verticality in embodiment, balance, forces and motion. So examples of embodiment in architecture. This is the Shembe Church in South Africa, where ritual has come to replace architecture. And the body is used as architecture. So you can see the creation of a church through people's bodies. So it's a kind of an architecture which is temporary, which is made for an event, and then which changes after the event. So this idea of looking at how we can arrive at an architecture based on knowledge, indigenous knowledge systems, was explored in a workshop which was run by Elena Rockhead and Dieter Brandt in 2014, situated in the Cradle of Humankind, which again, similar to what was said before, looked at spirituality that's coming from up and above, surface movement, which is where culture is formed, and the history that occurs below ground. So the Cradle of Humankind in South Africa is the site where some of the most oldest fossils of human have been found. And this was the site for the workshop. And it's seen as the site where we had the birth of consciousness, of human consciousness and cognitive ability. So the workshop was about drawing and writing, fundamental means of human expression, and the cornerstone for the creation, depiction, and development of architecture and the ideas that inform it. So it looked at a site and the process of mapping physical features and historic events relative to a site. And this is integral to how we intersect as architects with humankind and the earth. The origins of human existence and the landmarks of generations materially dictate or inspire usage and non-usage of the environment. And these are the architect's tools of reference. So imagine a site, South Africa's rocks go back, 3 billion years? And because of the nature of the dolomite rock around the Cradle of Humankind, a lot of fossils were found of the early hominids in this environment, in the caves that exist just outside of Johannesburg. So the workshop was really to look at if the original inhabitants were to become architects and design, what kind of methods would they use to design the environment. So in this case, what we did for the workshop, and again, this is talking to method, working with indigenous methods, was we went into caves and tried to redraw what we saw in the caves in the darkness to kind of see whether your body would remember the design. So rather than using your eyes, because we're generally nowadays, we're a visual society, we use our eyes mostly, but if you were to draw using your body, what would the results be? And you can see this is an example of some of the ways of trying to imagine a world that the original inhabitants would have imagined. So on the right is a drawing that's done of the caves by myself in total darkness. And then as you move through, how you then translate that into an architectural idea that you can then use to develop further the designs. These are drawings by other participants, starting from a very rough sketch into a more designed piece of drawing, which then you can imagine on the right what we call the invisible city, which is the life that's been inhabited underground. And finally, imagining that the world as imagined by Australopithecus, the original inhabitants. So again, we've really been trying to look at this idea of working with the first inhabitants of the world and how they would imagine designing as architects. So this conference has really given me an opportunity to start trying to articulate a way of working that works with this idea of an embodied knowledge. And I think a lot of work that we've done in South Africa recently gave us an opportunity to test some of these ideas. The project I'll show you now is a project called Freedom Park in Pretoria, which was a 10-year project, which was as a result of a truth and reconciliation process that happened in South Africa after the liberation of the country, where we said freedom was not free. So part of the truth and reconciliation process said that we need to have symbolic reparations. And that those symbolic reparations were meant to emancipate repressed voices, the African voices. And there needed to be a place where this would happen, which was the Freedom Park project. This is the site of the hill outside of Pretoria. And we were given this quote by our President Thabo Mbeki at the time, who said, "Let me begin, I'm an African. I owe my being to the hills, the valleys, mountains, and glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land." And the brief was really, how do we create a memorial on this hillside outside of the city to commemorate those repressed voices of the past? So the hill, it says, "At times and in fear I've wondered whether I should concede equal citizenship of our country to the leopard and the lion, the elephant and the springbok, the hyena, the black mamba, and the pestilent mosquito. A human presence among all of these, a feature on the face of our native land thus defined." So again, we're working with the idea that we concede equal citizenship to the animals as much as to the human beings on this project. So in the context of a society which is animistic, in other words, we believe that spirituality exists not only in human beings, but in inanimate objects. We embarked on this project trying to bring into it indigenous knowledge systems and beliefs. The first act, as in traditional culture, when you inhabit a space, is to kind of define the boundaries by planting trees around the site that defines your boundaries. A lot of those trees have qualities that attract lightning, so in that way you attract lightning away from the inhabitation. So the first act in this case was to plant the tree at the top of the hill and the trees around the edges to kind of make the site sacred and to protect it from lightning and malevolent spirits. And then this was inaugurated again at a national event. First time in our country that indigenous knowledge was used at the scale of the nation. The next idea, because this was a site that really was to commemorate people who had lost their lives in the struggle for liberation, was to say, how do we bring back the spirits of those who had died in far-off lands? Now, in the way we manage death in our society, we need a close relationship between those who are living and those who have passed on, as a way not to worship those who have passed, but to say that there's a connection, and that we therefore revere those who have come before us. And in our case, because a lot of people had perished in far-off lands, the first project was about how we bring their spirits back into the land so that we could come and speak to them when we needed to. And so the project was really to bring back the spirits of people who had died from different parts of the countries. And what happened was that ceremonies were held in those particular countries, across the continent particularly. And in those ceremonies, the soil from those countries was brought back into the Freedom Park. And that soil was then integrated into this installation here. In similar form, the boulders, you'll see there are actually 9 boulders. These boulders were brought from the 9 provinces of our country, And at each site, a boulder would be chosen by all the denominations, all the faith-based organizations. That boulder would then be prayed around and then brought to this site. They were kind of blessed and then brought to the site and then integrated into the site. And in that way, each part of the country could recognize a bit of themselves in this memorial. Other aspects of it, of course, is the water, which is very important in terms of cleansing and healing. Because the African concept of justice is restorative and not retributive. And that in order to restore, we need to constantly cleanse and heal ourselves as a nation. So this becomes the first site of cleansing and healing for the nation. And what you find now is that it has been adopted that every year you get ritual again, and that ritual is about healing the past. And through all those trances, the dances, we connect ourselves back to our ancestors. We connect ourselves back to the spirits of those who passed on and are now in our midst. And this is where architecture and dance and ritual all come together to kind of create that continuity between the past and the future. And the next part of the project, because obviously this had a lot of resistance from peoples who believe more in a kind of a Christian way of memorialization or Western memorialization, to say that, no, but where are we in this nation-building project? So this was a very initial sketch for the space of commemoration at the top of the hill. And the idea that these forces, you'll see the circles, was about how you gather people from different strands of life, from different cultures, from different backgrounds, all to a unity of purpose at the top of the hill. And the idea that there is not one single story and one single narrative, but that everybody comes from a particular place, but we make our nation by bringing all these narratives together, a sign of unity of purpose. So some of the, again, initial sketches of how you create an environment that gathers people together from different walks of life in a non-hierarchical way. And how you look to the past and some of the settlements that were developed. On the top is the original settlement of King Shaka in Ngungundlovu. And how community was created and the idea of gathering and how you define that becomes an inspiration for the future. And how you again work with the hill so that what you develop seems to be part of the landscape and is not separate as an artifact, as kind of Western architecture would do. But we were striving to achieve an architecture that kind of grows out of the landscape and seems to be part of it. So the final element at the top of the hill, which had various elements, all circular form, different ways of circulating around it, different ways of gathering the people, using both indigenous knowledge and, in this case, some of the typical Western ways of memorializing the past through a wall of names, eternal flames, etc. So what gathers you up the hill is this series of walls of names of people who perished over the different conflicts in the history of our country, and their different ways of circulating and arriving at the top. How the site has been made an icon through the recognition of the reeds in African mythology as a way in which human beings descended into the earth through the reeds. And so there's this connection between what's up above and what's below through the reeds, and that becomes the iconic element, which is really trying to say that it is part of a natural environment and it is not the dominion of human beings over all else, but that we are part of the environment and the earth. And that at the culmination, at the top of the hill, is what looks like a cave, which is growing out of the hill, which is the sanctuary, which is, as originally people sought sanctuary in the cave. This was meant to then be kind of the culmination of creating a sanctuary for the nation. And that in that sanctuary, there's the presence of water, which gives us life. There's the presence of the reeds from where we came from. And that this water kind of ebbs and flows depending on what's happening within that sanctuary. And how the spaces inside try and replicate the idea of the inhabiting of cave dwellings, which was our original inhabitation. And of course the presence of fire. Fire which first allowed us to gather together, and as some people believe was the origins of language, because once we gathered together around the fire, we then had to do something with each other. So we decided to invent language so that we could tell stories. And those stories happened around the fire with the sustenance of water. The idea that all human beings emerged from the reeds and spread and multiplied on the earth. Annually, we have in various parts of our country a reed dance where people gather reeds for the new summer season. And it's kind of an idea of renewal that happens every year. So again, the idea that through ritual we create architecture, because those reeds then go to the king's palace to kind of maintain the thatched roofs and to maintain the enclosures. So it's a kind of a renewal ritual that happens. In architecture, it would just be an annual maintenance thing, but now it has been ritualized. So how do we then interpret that idea of annual renewal through the reeds at the top of the hill, and the idea that those reeds would gather us as a nation? And so we had these stainless steel rods installed within the landscape of the Freedom Park at the top of the hill, and that would kind of symbolize the annual renewal and the gathering that would happen to create that idea of community. And this theme of reeds becomes a very important one even going forward in the work that we're doing, because it's a very important symbol of renewal and growth. And also it then means that your monument is only complete by how it reacts with the environment. It's that it's not, it's a thing on its own, but it's completed by how it interacts with the sky, with the sun, with the clouds, etc. So this was really trying to say, if we were to create a monument which was more in keeping with indigenous knowledge systems, it meant it had to be a much lighter monument that talked more about the hill and the environment than about itself as an object. And this has been, quite a challenging thing to address, and also to create a monument or memorial that everybody could find themselves in, no matter where they came from. And some of the developments come out of the Great Zimbabwe palaces. So looking to the history of architecture that comes from the region. Using water and mythologies around origins of life again. There's some people who are said to have emerged from the water, and that the water is a source of knowledge, and that you are able to go to the water to seek knowledge. And the idea that our ancestors inhabit the rocks, and therefore if we want to commune with them, you have to kind of delve into the rock, either sit perched on its edge so that you get communion with the whole world, or where you bury yourself into the rock to actually hear your ancestors speak to you. And how would you then interpret that for Freedom Park, that there is a space now where the nation can go and commune with itself in times of crisis? Again, how the idea of the reeds and the ascending line, that is also talking about the triumph of the human spirit over conflict, and how that works with the hillside as a space that really memorializes the struggles of the past. And how do you then tell that story to the world? What we've talked about now is a kind of more embodied sense of memorialization, but in the same way that we need to be able to articulate it as a community, that this is our dream. This building, which was called Kapo Khe Kapo Tama, Kapo Hasib Dis Tamas Kaibu, which is in Khoi language, a dream is not a dream until it has been shared by the entire community. How do we share a dream? So the story goes that traditionally, when the nation was in crisis, the women would go to the top of the hill and roll rocks down into the rivers at the bottom, and in that way create a lot of noise and commotion, and that would bring out everybody to understand that there's a crisis, whether it's the beating of drums of war or whatever other crisis there might be. And so we took that idea of the boulders and that they'd been rolled down the hill and kind of worked with that to create the interpretive center as a series of boulders that had fallen down the hill into this commemorative garden. So looking at study of the boulders, boulders are also used by the Khoisan, which is why they do a lot of the paintings on them, because they believe it's a veil between this world and the next world. And if you can experience, if you stare at the rock long enough, you begin to imagine a world that exists inside it. So we looked closely at the rocks and the formations that occurred on the site and said, can we imagine ourselves inhabiting those rocks? And so the building became a series of rocks that we could inhabit and which our story could inhabit. So at the bottom of the hill, where the reeds are at the top, you can imagine a series of boulders that have been thrown down to indicate that there's a crisis. And that crisis is that we are not cohesive as a nation, and that our memories are contained inside that rock. And therefore, this becomes where the story is told of our triumph over conflict, the triumph of the human spirit. So this is from the top view, from the area of the reeds looking down to the area where the boulders have fallen, and these now contain our memories. So once again, you'll see the formation of the boulders, which tell the stories of the 7 epochs of the development of our country. Each of the epochs inhabits one of the bigger forms, and then you go into a constricted space to move on to the next epoch. So it kind of suggests that there was a cataclysmic change that moved us from one area into the next in our history. And that if you imagined inhabiting those boulders, the walls would not be straight up and Cartesian, but they would kind of take on that fractured look of the stones as you moved through the various spaces. And where the rock has been cracked and lifted, you get views outside into the natural environment. This is a little bit out of place, but I'll read it anyway. As we're living more and more in an intangible economy in which the greatest source of wealth are no longer physical but perceptual, intellectual, and emotional, the value of architecture is no longer appraised merely as a formal object, but by its ability to elicit relevant transformation in people and places. And for us in South Africa, coming from the past that we did, it is very important that we find ways in which we can transform our society through the development of spaces that allow for that transformation. So I'll move on to the next project, a project that was called the Day of Necessity, cryptically, and that happened in December 2013. So we were given a brief for the project, not knowing what it was, that said we need to create enabling works and temporary facilities for an event that is going to occur at a time which we do not know. The program is unknown. It would be determined through an act of God. This is your client briefing you. The location, there'll be various locations around the country. Installation period, you'll have 12 days to complete this project, when it happens. And the impact of this project, well, it's got a global impact. The status of the project is classified, and we cannot talk about it to anybody. This has been one of the most difficult projects that I've ever had to deal with. So, 100 years ago, this person was born today, actually. I'm sure you'd know who that is. And we had to do a project that was in preparation for his final party, or his final departure. So we were told that it would be a homecoming to his rural home, which is almost 200 kilometers from the nearest town center. Why is this thing jumping? And that you would have dignitaries from all around the world who would come to pay their last respects. When this would happen, they didn't know. Eventually, it happened, as we all know now, in 2013. And we had 12 days then to put up the installation. So we were asked to, the brief was, how do you commemorate somebody who has global significance using indigenous knowledge, because this is the first time that an African would be on a global stage in terms of the event that was to happen. And that we want you to design something that we can clearly say comes out of the way we commemorate the departed in an African sense, but at the level of the state. So we kind of looking for clues in indigenous practices. Again, the idea of reeds and the importance of reeds in life and the cycle of life. The thorns that you see, which Kholihlahla, which is his name, talks to the idea of thorns and the bushes. And some of the traditional wear, which is made for various cultural events. Again, just looking for clues from kind of indigenous practices. Looking at traditional ways of building, traditional ways of inhabitation, of dress, of celebration, to really develop that final event. And how these might be interpreted into a kind of contemporary situation of a funeral of a global statesman. So again, the reeds became quite a dominant theme in the development of the design. And then these beads, when children get born in our culture, they have these beads which are made out of seeds that are tied around them and are used to protect them from any malevolent spirits. And so the idea that these beads were a continuation of life or protection of life became quite an interesting element to use in the design. And so what we came up with was to develop the portrait that normally goes into your stage set, but made out of beads, so that there's an idea that the representation of a person's image is done through elements that are normally used to protect your life. So you can see that these beads, this is the artist who worked on the portrait using, I don't know how many beads, it was thousands and thousands. And this is all done in secret in preparation for the event. And that was how the kind of portrait, which we had to sell it quite hard to the powers that be, that this is a portrait which is quite ephemeral in the way that it is lit and in the way that it represents. But it talks about the temporality of life. And the 93 candles that were placed as a signifier of the 93 years he spent on this earth. And how the stage originally was designed to kind of replicate the traditional house, but in the negative. So you see the 3 arches, which would have been made by, I think there were about 7,000 rods, stainless steel rods, which would then recreate the traditional houses in a different way, with the choirs and the bands that would accompany the service. And this is a installation plan for all the rods, 5,635 rods to make up that stage. And the idea that these would all be prepared for the event, and we'd have to find a way to install them within those 12-day window period. And how we would work with the cameras and the lighting to kind of recreate the way we decorate ourselves at events over this installation. And some of the initial sketches of how you worked with the event people to recreate that stage. Working with much lighter materials, stretch fabric, the lecterns, the podium, all the elements that would be needed on the stage. But what happened was that halfway through the construction, our president became very sick, and therefore we had to find a much quicker way to develop this idea. So with the event company, a series of arches which tried to recreate that form, but obviously not in the way that we'd originally intended, was developed. And then the reeds became part of the backdrop. But as you imagine, those reeds, had they been developed to form those arches, would have made a much more ephemeral installation. And this was the final outcome that was, again, trying to work with the indigenous knowledge systems. We've got the cowhide that represents the burial of an important person. In the past, people would have been buried in cowhides and not in coffins. But these were now laid out on the floor as symbolic of that same thing. And yeah, I guess that has been my journey in trying to work with our indigenous knowledge systems into architecture. These are some of the other projects that our practice has been involved in. The South African Embassy in Berlin, Germany, a market for indigenous traders who trade in indigenous medicine, traditional medicine, some of the residential work that talks to the initial ideas around inhabitation and dwelling of caves, even within the inner city where we develop parks, public parks. We're always trying to look for ways of linking the story and making one story out of what inspires us, which is really about where we come from and where we're going to as human beings. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mphethi, for your showing us the way that you are thinking about how indigeneity comes through in your architecture. So thank you all for joining us tonight. You're now welcome to proceed upstairs to our atrium on the first floor, where we'll be officially opening the exhibition. And if you don't get a chance to look at it tonight, I encourage you to come back before it closes on the 30th of July. Thank you very much.